Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on why regulatory affairs deserves a seat in the boardroom. I'm Gay Esther, the marketing manager here at RegDesk, and if you don't know what we do, we are an AI-powered regulatory information management platform with built-in regulatory intelligence. Our Intelligent RIM platform allows RA teams to leverage AI to prepare, manage, and publish international submissions smarter and faster. To focus on you for a minute, thank you for joining us. Like I said, we really do appreciate you taking time out of your schedule today to be here. We will have a Q&A session at the end, so if you run across any questions while Jodi is presenting them, feel free to put your questions in the either chat or the Q&A section, and we'll pull from both of those at the end. We'll save about the last 10 minutes for that. And then we will share the slide deck and replay after this, so in the next couple of days, be on the lookout for that. And that will come out as soon as we can get everything together after the webinar. Now, let me take a moment to introduce our esteemed expert, Jodi Granger. Jodi is the Director of Regulatory Affairs at RegDesk. She brings over 36 years of experience in quality and regulatory roles within the medical device and IVD industry. She has held leadership roles overseeing global regulatory teams, driving the development and execution of regulatory strategies for all classes of medical devices worldwide. And Jodi has just a wealth of information to share, so I know you're excited to be here today. And Jodi, thank you so much for joining us. I know they're going to get so much value. We appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Gay, and thank you everyone for joining. I hope that it's time well spent. We're going to talk, as Gay mentioned, about why regulatory deserves a seat in the boardroom. We'll walk through what the common problem is in the industry where regulatory does not sit in that seat, and how we need to help to influence a mindset shift within our organizations. We'll talk a bit about what executive leadership really needs from us as regulatory professionals, how we can better advance that by proper communication with our internal stakeholders, how our credibility really factors into the success of this entire effort. And then, as Gay mentioned, we'll have time for a Q&A at the end. So let's talk about the problem. What I want to say first of all is that most organizations aren't purposely saying, let's leave regulatory affairs out until the end. It's really not their intent to treat regulatory affairs as the final stop. Many times especially organizations that aren't as mature, they fall into this category because they're focused too much on the end. Can we submit? Are we ready to submit? Is this particular thing compliant? What document am I missing, etc. So they're focused too much on small task-related input from regulatory affairs and not a more holistic strategic viewpoint. So with that, some of the current behavior in especially mid to smaller environments is, I'll give a few examples. Regulatory will review this particular document prior to submission. V&V is a good example, validation and verification reports. In a lot of organizations, they don't have regulatory in the loop on reviewing those protocols before they are executed. And then they're only seeing the final report after all the data is collected. Anyone who's been in that position and finds that the data that was collected really has gaps in terms of how you're going to present the safety and efficacy of that device, it's really challenging because it's too late. You've already, moved past. You've built your samples. You've done whatever testing you thought was necessary. If you've missed something and you now need to go back and rebuild samples, have them sterilized, potentially aged to do something that's missing, it really impacts the overall timeline. So it's important to identify specific types of documents and deliverables where regulatory needs to be on the front end and not at the end of that process. With that in mind, also, engineering sometimes has to make decisions on their design as they go about their feasibility testing. And it's important to get regulatory in the loop, because if engineering moves forward with a particular decision without regulatory as a sounding board, that decision may impact your regulatory strategy, and it may have adverse consequences to that regulatory strategy. So we should be in the loop so that we can help influence the right decision to mitigate any risks that the company might be facing with trying to get this new product or modified product to market. Another area that I've seen many times is the launch dates are either communicated to customers or they're communicated during, quarterly review meetings to stakeholders. And that launch date, if it hasn't been vetted or bought into by regulatory, can have significant credibility impacts with our customers and our clients. If that launch date is not realistic in terms of what regulatory can deliver as far as approval timelines, et cetera, then that has, a lot of impact to your commercial commitments. Another area is looking at your project in terms of the first milestone you want to hit. I'll give an example. If you are going to submit in the United States first, in the United States, you need English for your labeling, and you can have electronic IFUs, but not all markets accept those, and other markets require translations. So if you have to have a paper in the box IFU in multiple languages, the size of that IFU is going to obviously be different than if you only have an electronic IFU for the US. Well, that's easy, right? You just go ahead and translate and get that paper document ready. But if all of your testing, your shipping, your transportation testing, your sterilization testing, all included samples without a physical IFU in the box, and one that may have some mass due to the multiple translations, then again, you may need to go back and retest. So those are just some examples of where regulatory isn't in the loop early enough. So as a result of that late regulatory environment, I've seen some real world consequences. So I've seen examples where FDA has rejected biocompatibility data because the justifications for waiving testing were not adequate. Regulatory should be reviewing your biocompatibility plans to let you know what risks are involved if you are waiving biocompatibility tests, and ensure that everyone in the organization understands those risks if you choose to move forward without testing. I already mentioned the labeling issue in regards to additional translations being needed. Those packaging and stability tests are critical, and so you need to make sure that it's reflective of the finished device that is going to be needed to market globally. If you change your software architecture after your cybersecurity review, that could result in additional delays or having to backtrack and reconduct that cybersecurity review. Also, certainly with MDR going into effect, we found a number of evidence gaps that were discovered after design freeze. We had to go back and do additional testing to support the increased scrutiny in Europe for MDR compliance. So it's important to understand that lost time in approval, any of these areas where you're having to backtrack, equates to lost revenue. So with that, you can have delayed launches. You're duplicating work, so that not only impacts time, but it impacts resources. It impacts, your commitments to external stakeholders. It can add in unnecessary costs. It can result in a redesign. I've seen entire packaging configurations have to be completely redesigned in order to accommodate a global IFU, and ultimately missed business goals. So it's important that we all work to help our organizations with a mind shift change. So traditionally, regulatory is kind of looked at in many ways, quality is, and that's like, let us do the work and then we'll let you review it. We'll let you review it at the end, where from a strategic mindset, we should be helping to shape that work, helping to define what's necessary up front. Regulatory, typically we're focused on just approving submissions and getting them out the door, but we can influence portfolio decisions. So we can influence what types of products or portfolio expansions may be able to be reached more readily by implementing good regulatory strategy. Regulatory was tracking compliance, but in reality, we need to help enable business strategy. We're reporting out on activities like what submissions have we gotten approved, but really we should be looking at what is the business impact of those approvals, or likewise, what are the business impacts of any delays in those approvals that may come about. So instead of joining in these types of processes late in the game, it's really beneficial to an organization overall to participate right from the beginning of an idea on either on a new product introduction, an acquisition that you may be having, even a manufacturing site transfer change, which has huge regulatory implications. If regulatory is at the table in the beginning, they could kind of help to guide and let the organization understand what the impact of the choices each of you are making in your own functional areas. So ideally, regulatory helps to guide, as I mentioned, whether you should be pursuing a particular market. Maybe there are some design elements or some extra regulatory hurdles for a particular product that you need to be made aware of so that you can better assess if you should pursue a specific market. You can ask is the product strategy feasible? You may have a great idea of a product if it's a class 2 product, but you don't have a predicate device in the United States that kind of wraps around the safety and efficacy elements of that device. Maybe it is too novel. You may have to shift your regulatory strategy in order to make it feasible. Regulatory can also guide which pathway creates the fastest commercialization timeline. We are on an ongoing basis seeing a significant increase across the globe on some countries relying on other approvals in other major markets to help facilitate market entry into rest of world countries. So understanding how all that lays in and layers in to create the best pathway on where your focus should be first is really important. If you're a US manufacturer, as an example, that US approval is going to be a gating item for you to go in many rest of world markets because you need a certificate of foreign government as part of your registration package. So there are certain countries where you will be excluded from even submitting and trying to gain approval until you can obtain that document. So having the understanding of what those variables are, what those interdependencies are, is really crucial for you to create that commercialization timeline. Also, it's important to understand what evidence needs to be generated in terms of the safety and efficacy. now in order to avoid delays later. So understanding what you should be testing, what the expectations of the regulatory authorities are going to be, so that you can factor that into your design and development planning, and you can factor that into your verification and validation plans, is really important to ensure that the project overall is successful. So regulatory has a role to play in this whole activity. So you can't just say you want a seat at the table, but you need to help to guide your business partners into understanding why that's important. So regulatory should be able to explain how the regulations of that particular product affect portfolio decisions. They need to understand commercial sequencing and what makes sense, not only from a regulatory perspective, but also the goals of the organization in terms of where they think they're going to have the most sales. It's important to be able to communicate how you, as a regulatory professional, can help boost the return on investment and the bottom line revenue. And also, as I mentioned before, understanding what evidence can be leveraged globally if you're creating or getting approvals in some markets, being able to leverage that for a faster market entry in other countries as well. So where regulatory really creates enterprise value, instead of asking in your organization, what does regulatory do? You should really be asking, what business decisions should regulatory influence? So in terms of which products enter into the portfolio, regulatory can help contribute by looking at the feasibility assessment. They can look at, from a design point of view, are you able to find adequate predicate devices where necessary? Are you able to show the safety and efficacy of the devices across the markets, and understanding what the regulators in each country are going to be expecting? They can help to determine which countries should launch first. That regulatory sequencing, as I mentioned before, is critical, especially even for the commercial team to understand. Just because you have approval in the United States doesn't mean you can automatically start your registrations in other countries. You need to get your CFG as an example. That's an additional deliverable. There's a time associated with requesting that document. So the regulatory sequencing and mapping out all of those dependencies in your global regulatory plans will provide great value to your organization. If you're acquiring another company, that acquisition due diligence, having someone from the regulatory team in that due diligence process is critical. If you're acquiring a team, part of what you should be looking at is, even if they have products that are cleared and on the market, you need to be able to look at their evidence of not only their submissions and approvals that have been filed, but also what, if any, changes they have made to a product since they've gotten those approvals, and are there any hidden regulatory risks in there? So you want to make sure that you understand all of that up front before an acquisition decision is made. Otherwise, you may have increased regulatory liabilities that are hiding in the background. In terms of the product roadmap, a lot of companies that I've worked at that are really successful with their product roadmap strategy brings regulatory into the loop, so that regulatory can look at the trends that may be occurring globally and how that might impact the roadmap itself. This especially is true if you are looking at some novel medical devices that you are trying to develop, and understanding where those trends may be. So AI legislation is a great example. Companies started developing different medical devices that incorporated AI technology. There's a lot of movement in the regulatory space on regulation governing AI technology. So understanding that trend and how it may impact your ability to get these products on the market, may significantly change your roadmap timeframe. Clinical investment is also another key area. Understanding which countries are going to require clinical evidence and if they are going to need patients from their specific population in order to accept that clinical evidence is really critical as well. So having someone on the regulatory side partner with your clinical team and the rest of your team to really understand what that clinical investment needs to be up front will help you ensure that you don't hit roadblocks later on. Technology selection, AI features, and manufacturing changes, those are all areas as well that regulatory can bring additional value by getting into those conversations up front. Manufacturing changes, I'll mention, is one area that I think a lot of companies struggle with. You may need to make a manufacturing change simply because you have a supplier who's no longer going to be able to provide you a critical component, as an example. And understanding what that regulatory impact is going to be, and the fact that approvals for that change in the markets where you currently sell may differ, really requires you to create a very robust plan on how you're going to roll out those changes within the organization, so that your customers can continue to receive product. So in terms of what executive leadership really needs and what they're looking for, currently regulatory reports out in a lot of organizations on just very simple metrics. What approvals did we get? What deficiencies have come in? What are the submission status and what are the risks? So it's important to not only provide these kind of high-level metrics to your organization, but how that kind of translates into the business goals. So if you did receive deficiencies on a particular submission, part of your communication needs to include what that impact is. Do we expect that there's going to be an 8-week launch in the delay, which will impact your projected revenue that is currently in the forecast and being counted on for a particular market. So translating the information regulatory has in terms of milestones with those true business outcomes is really what the executive team needs to understand. So when you're looking at regulatory metrics, you need to move beyond those. What submissions have we done? What approvals are in place? The deficiencies, the audits, etc., and try to bring in some additional value information for your executive team. So with the submissions, if you've done 10 submissions and you've gotten clearance ahead of schedule, as an example, what revenue has that accelerated? What launches has that enabled that will affect your bottom line? If you've been able to expand your legacy products into other markets, having an understanding and a communication of what new countries have been opened for your portfolio is important. Also looking at regulatory cycle time. So regulators in many countries, of course, give a defined timeline of when you can expect approval, but it's important to look at that data and compare it to what you're actually achieving in real time. Sometimes the delta between what the average approval times are and those that you're actually receiving are very telling in terms of the adequacy of your submission and the resources that are put behind deficiency letters, as an example. I had one experience where I worked at a company whose regulatory cycle times for China were absolutely horrific. They were 2.5, 3 year approval times. And when you got in and you really looked at the data, you could find that it wasn't the China regulatory agency that was driving those timelines up, but the fact that once questions were received, internal resources were not assigned and prioritized to get responses back to the agency quickly. So all of the lead time from the time you first submitted and that approval was really internal inefficiencies that caused such great lead times. So look at that regulatory cycle time. It's important to look at that over the course not only of this year, but prior years as well. Time to commercialization. Sometimes there are activities that need to occur after approval in order to actually start selling the product. So being able to put some metrics in around that and in terms of how regulatory can impact it is valuable to the team. Portfolio risk reduction is where you are really looking at key variables within your portfolio and what countries you may have more difficulty getting approvals in place, or managing renewals as an example, or managing change. So being able to put at a high level where those risks are can help to reduce those risks over time. The regulatory forecast accuracy really goes back to that cycle time. It's not just what the agency is saying our average cycle time for approval, but how well did you do in comparison to those industry norms? And that will provide you with more predictable approval predictability. So evidence reuse across markets. This is where you've got that ability to leverage approvals in certain jurisdictions to help you streamline approval in others. So being able to tie and link all of that together for your executive team will help them, especially in terms of building strategy for the next product launch. That helps them to understand what kind of impact that can have. And also, the percentage of first cycle approvals, meaning are you consistently able to submit documentation to the regulatory authority without getting questions from that agency? Or if you are getting questions, that they are things that are quickly turned around and more clarifying activities versus oh, now we need to retest and this is going to be a significant delay. So I encourage all the regulatory teams to stop measuring just activity, but also try to translate that data into how you are measuring business outcomes and how you are influencing those business outcomes. In terms of communication, part of our goal, if we want to become a member on the board basically of our company and make sure that regulatory is included on the front end, is in how we communicate information. So, many times we'll be monitoring regulatory activities. We may say, well, FDA issued this new guidance document, or MDR has updated this annex. Well, that doesn't mean much to the executive team. You have to translate that information into what they care about. So if the guidance that is issued by FDA for AI changes your software roadmap, and it may require additional validation testing or an additional study that will delay your launch by a quarter, that your executive team will understand, and they will help to provide resourcing and funding for those activities. Likewise, with the MDR annex that changed, this could impact a certain amount of revenue that is counted on for your end of year goals. So being able to take those particular regulatory changes and equate that to what makes sense from an executive point of view will help you kind of earn your seat at the table with those stakeholders. If you've received a deficiency letter from an agency, it's important, of course, to let the executive team know that that deficiency letter was received and that they need to understand the risk level. Is this a deficiency letter where we only need to clarify information that may have been in the filing, but the regulator didn't understand it or they just didn't find it? Or is this more significant where we need to do additional testing? It's also important. So many companies are kind of siloed with their regulatory submissions, meaning larger organizations have teams that are only responsible for the US, teams that are only responsible for the EU. And then you have many regional teams that might handle Latin America or Asia Pacific. Getting the deficiency letters shared across not only your regulatory organization, but your executive team can really help you to operationalize that information. If I, as a regulatory person responsible for the US, got a list of questions from the regulator, I need to share that with my regional partners so that when they're doing their filing to the regulatory agencies in Latin America, as an example, that you make sure that they take into account the type of questions or queries that came from other markets so that they can proactively address those in their application and not just wait and see if those regulators come back with the same types of deficiencies. So operationalize that deficiency letter information, and it will help you to streamline your approvals in all of your rest of world markets. I mentioned earlier in regards to manufacturing changes, sometimes manufacturing changes are significant and they need to be resubmitted across the majority of global markets that you're in. It becomes very challenging if you need, for some reason, to implement that change critically for a specific market. You need to understand how those approvals are going to be staggered across the time. It could be even as much as a year and a half difference between the first country that gets approval for that change and the last country. So you need to help create a solid plan within your organization for how are we going to manage inventory of building the old design in markets where we don't have the new design approved. And you'll need to ensure that all of your customers can still receive that product during this transition. So when you're communicating with executive leadership, you need to kind of remember what their priorities are. They are looking at achieving the strategic business objectives, accelerating revenue and market growth, managing their risk, and delivering products to the market on time. If they've made public-facing commitments, then they are going to be focused on meeting those commitments in terms of product launch timelines. So it's important when you're sitting at the table to talk to them about these areas and how regulatory is influencing them. Explain to them where there is any business risk based on the regulatory strategies and how those risks might be mitigated. Be very clear about the time to market and launch timelines. Be sure you factor in dependencies. If you need US approval before you can even begin starting a regulatory submission in another market, that should be very evident in your plan. And the launch timelines, are never guaranteed because regulator responses and questions are out of our control, but you can help to make those timelines more robust by looking at your past performance and also making sure that you fully understand the requirements and that you're submitting the documentation that the regulator expects to see. You can also help to influence market access opportunities. So if you know that there is a list of countries for this particular device that has a less burdensome regulatory pathway or a very quick regulatory pathway, if you make the executive team aware of that, then maybe the US market won't be the first one that they focus on. Maybe they will let some rest of world countries go first so that they can get some real clinician experience that might guide their launch strategy, as an example. So those are some of the areas, if you're using executive leadership as your stakeholder that you're communicating with, that you should consider in your communications. In terms of R&D, their priorities, of course, are building innovative products. They need to meet their development milestones. They need to understand and communicate out the technical feasibility of a given product. They need a efficient, compliant, safe, and effective product design for the product's intended use. And you need to ensure that you're reducing redesign and rework. So regulatory helps to do that by ensuring that the requirements for a given product is well understood by the R&D team. They should understand what evidence they need to generate in order for you to do your submissions. And that comes down even to very detailed lists of what testing, what standards they need to meet, what is going to be the, sample sizes that are expected. Do you need a predicate device, and help to guide what that predicate device should be, etc. So all of the regulatory communications with R&D helps to influence their priorities by making them well aware of what's going to be expected from the regulators. Those should all kind of be design inputs going into the system. When you're communicating with your quality teams, of course, they're looking at maintaining compliance. They're worried about the product quality and safety, audit readiness, process consistency, continuous improvement, etc. So many conversations with quality when it comes to what regulatory is influencing is really looking at what standards and what regulations are going to apply to for this given product based on the market that you intend to sell. What documentation requirements are there going to be? All of the regulatory documentation is also subject to audit. So your submissions that are going into regulatory authorities, your approval letters need to be on file and organized so that if they're asked for during an audit to prove that, yes, we had approval in place before we started selling, that regulatory is responsible for maintaining those records. We also help to close, review, and assess different CAPAs within the quality system. And of course, all the objective evidence supporting our regulatory decisions, especially with product changes that may be happening. You need to do that assessment for each country where you sell that product. And all of that may be audited, by different regulatory authorities coming into the organization. On the commercial side, their priorities are really looking at successful product launches, revenue growth, market expansion, competitive positioning, customer adoption. So talk to them about realistic launch timing, how different approvals might be needed before you can move into other markets. Talk to them about geographic expansion strategies. So if you have an existing portfolio of products, many organizations are like, oh, we just want to go everywhere. But being able to help guide them on, well, what is the cost of actually doing that? It helps to bring awareness that it's not as easy as let's just submit everywhere. If you have a product that doesn't have a translation in place, you're going to need resources to do that. It costs money to translate your documentation, your IFUs, etc. If it's a wireless product, you need to have a wireless registration in place and maintained. So having those conversations about geographic expansion helps commercial to understand that maybe they need to look a little more closely at the return on investment in their decisions and not just say, let's go everywhere. There are potential labeling implications depending on the type of device. Different countries require different information on the labels, and you need to make sure that you are going to be compliant if you're selling there. So it's important to understand those labeling implications up front, your market readiness, country-specific regulatory considerations. Again, there might be a need for different clinical data, as an example, in some countries, depending on the device itself. And, there may need to be an additional clinical study performed in order to meet that threshold. And then the commercial impact of regulatory timelines. What I'd like to be able to show is not just the downside, meaning, it's going to take us 90 days or 180 days to get approval there, but also be able to show them where you are successful in your regulatory strategies, how you've been able to operationalize that commercialization of product. If you've done your work and allowed them to go to market several months early, bring those types of figures and conversations into the commercial discussion. So all of the things that I just discussed in terms of communication are really intended to help you build credibility. You need to understand who you're talking to and what their goals and their priorities are in order to facilitate and present the information in a meaningful way to them. So as I mentioned before, just telling them, oh, you have to do it this way without giving them context isn't going to help you build that credibility. It's important that you explain what's required, explain why it's required. If it is a regulation-based piece of information, then educate them on that regulatory standard or requirement so that they understand that this isn't being driven out of what you think is necessary, but what is actually necessary. And that will help you to build credibility, and that will help to have them welcome the regulatory team to the table. So I would ask that anyone who really has a desire to have regulatory on the front end of any process within your organization is to be able to learn and understand how you can better communicate to those teams and make it very apparent that you are a strategic partner with them. So with that, you have work to do on your side. Learn and understand what your company's commercial strategy is. Quantify the regulatory requirements in terms of what it means for the business itself. Join projects before the requirements are written. So you need a partnership with your organization, your R&D team, et cetera, to make sure that you're in on the front end for feasibility. present options to them. So it's not just regulatory sitting at the table saying yes or no. You have to do it this way, or you can't move forward, but you need to also present options to them. So if there are risks involved, identify those risks, quantify those risks, explain how you would mitigate them, give them alternate strategies for mitigation if possible. And then the organization as a whole can come to the decisions that will most benefit the ultimate business goals of the company. And again, as I mentioned before, try to measure things in business impact and not just regulatory activity. Don't just say you got 5 approvals this year. Explain what those 5 approvals meant to the organization. What revenue did they impact? Were you able to get on the market faster? Were you delayed and that caused a negative impact on revenue? I think being transparent about all of those and trying to put the metrics in business impact will help you build the credibility that you need within the organization. So that's all I have for my presentations. We'll go into Q&A here in just a second, but I did want to just mention for those on the call that if you are interested in a regulatory information management platform such as RegDesk, but you wondered, is there really a return on investment for such a tool within the organization? We all know that budgets are tight and that it's hard sometimes to get funding in the regulatory space for new tools. So we just wanted to mention that we do offer a new process where we can help to build a return on investment assessment for your company specifically and how a RIM platform might benefit you. And also what areas of a RIM platform might bring you the most benefit. So if you are interested in looking at RegDesk more fully and potentially doing an ROI assessment for your company to see if this is something that you might find beneficial to your team, please give us a call. The phone number is listed here and also an email that you can contact if you would like to do so. Thank you so much, and we'll take questions, Kay, if we have any.
Perfect. Thanks, Jodi. I appreciate all the information, and the examples you gave, I think, really help people delve into what this means for them or what the impact could be. And I really appreciate the mindset change you told people they might need to have if they're going to shift over and help shift people's thought process about where regulatory affairs needs to sit within the business model. We do have a couple questions. I do want to throw out there if you want to do that ROI return on your investment, then you can also reply to me too. If you see my emails come through with the replay or slide deck, reply to me too, and I can get you to the right person if you didn't write down David's email. A couple questions. Let's start with, what are the most interesting and relevant regulatory affairs KPIs and how are they measured?
Yeah, I think the KPIs, again, need to factor in the business impact. So where I've seen executive teams much more responsive to regulatory KPIs is, again, not just saying we got this approval, but how did that impact the bottom line? So you'll have to partner with your commercial team in order to help develop some of this KPI output, but positioning each of your KPIs in that frame, I think, is important. Another area of KPIs that I think is important for your executive team to understand is just the volume of regulatory intelligence that your teams are having to assess and review and go through on a monthly basis. If you do this at your quarterly management review meetings, I think that's a good forum for it. But I think it gets easily lost in organizations how much time and effort it takes to really monitor regulation changes across the globe, bring that information into your organization, but also do the assessment is this something that we need to care about? Is this something we need to react to and create a plan for? So those are two areas that I would recommend.
Perfect. Keep the questions coming in. We have a few more, so I'll just keep going down these until we get towards the end of our time. How do you earn a seat at the executive table if leadership only views regulatory affairs as a compliance function?
I think part of that is building the credibility, making sure that you're positioning the information to them in terms that they care about. It's hard in organizations that don't have this mindset already to change the philosophy of the company. I think where you start is by asking for that seat at the table, but then while you're there, you need to show the benefit of having you there. You need to be bringing in that real value add information. Don't just sit there and say, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. You need to bring them solutions. You need to show how you were able to mitigate risk. You need to show how you were able to impact the bottom line by getting approvals in place more quickly.
Okay, then we have, how can regulatory demonstrate ROI when its success is preventing problems that never happen?
Well, I think you are able to do that because it's not just prevention of the problems that never happen. It's being able to show over time. We'll use just approval timelines as one example. So obviously the goal is to get approval. If you get approval, you've met your goal, right? So, but maybe it took 3 rounds of questions and a delayed launch in order to achieve that. So you need to show over time where you've operationalized that information. You got 3 rounds of deficiency letters in the US maybe, but then you were able to take that information and make sure that your rest of world submissions did not have those rounds of questions. So you've got to be able to translate the information such that you are showing the improvements and you're showing impact to the revenue growth.
And you've answered some of this, I think, with the KPI metrics, but what metrics should a VP of regulatory present each quarter?
Yeah, I think some of them we listed in the presentation. I think, the basics, of course, you're always going to do. You're going to tell them how many approvals you've got. You're going to tell them how many deficiencies. But I think the looking at the review times compared to industry standard is important. I think making sure that you're presenting what revenue was impacted by those approvals or delays is important. And, how your resourcing also is presented against the workload that you have. I think it's important to present that to executive team as well, because many regulatory teams are understaffed, and it's important to show if there's any kind of discrepancy in terms of what staff you have with your existing processes and the workload that's on your team's plate.
And I think you answered this a little bit too, but let's just see if you can clarify a little more. How early should regulatory become involved in product development?
In the beginning. So, feasibility phase, you should at least understand what product development is working on in those feasibility phases. Once decisions in the organization start to happen where they're saying, yeah, we think we've got something here. We think this is a product that we can develop and there would be a market for it. Regulatory needs to then be ingrained in the development process going forward. So early in the process, but it's important. I'll say it's very important for teams to ensure you're putting the right regulatory person in those early conversations as well. You need someone with some level of seasoned regulatory background in order to be able to provide that early guidance. Whereas maybe, an entry-level regulatory associate may not have enough strategic understanding of how they can influence those early stages. So make sure you're thinking of that as well in terms of putting the right people in those early stages versus the later stages where maybe the goal is just to write the submission and get it out the door.
Thank you. And then how do you balance being a business partner without compromising compliance?
Well, I mean, that's our job, compliance. We need to make sure that the company is compliant. I've always held a strong belief that no one in regulatory should be doing things that they feel is not in compliance. You should never sign a document that you do not agree with or that you do not feel comfortable with. But you also need to educate the folks that you're communicating with. If you feel something is not compliant, you need to be able to articulate why. You need to be able to pull the evidence, the standards, the regulation, et cetera, and explain why that particular, you have that particular viewpoint. So it's not just giving yes or no answers, but trying to educate them to define what the risks are, define a path forward on how to mitigate those risks so you can all align on a path forward.
Okay, and then how can regulatory improve its relationship with R&D?
I think a lot of the same holds true. It's really being a value added at the table and being able to explain to R&D the elements that you're trying to convey to them and not just giving them a list of here, you must do this. So building that partnership. I think folks that struggle with R&D relationships aren't bringing those types of qualities to the table. And so they'll regulatory shop. They'll just go around and see if they can get the answer that they want within the organization. I think you need to make sure that you're speaking from an understanding of knowledge and something to back up what you're explaining to them. And that'll help to build that relationship.
Okay, and we just have a couple more, so let's try to get through these and then we will be able to hopefully wrap a couple minutes early. Should regulatory own regulatory intelligence?
I think the initial triage and ownership of regulatory intelligence, yes, should fall within regulatory affairs. But many things that come across our plate in terms of changing regulation, or a changing standard, as an example, needs to also go out to other stakeholders. So if there's a new regulation that involves a change in a quality management system requirement for a particular country, you're obviously going to need your quality team to take the lead on something like that. So that initial triage, the monitoring piece of it, yes, I think it fits well within regulatory affairs, but all functions ultimately need to get involved.
Okay, and then I know we deal with a lot of larger companies at RegDesk, but how can small regulatory teams become more strategic?
It's a challenge for small teams. I think, the regulatory monitoring piece alone is a huge breadth of work. If you're selling your product, even in 10 markets or 20 markets, monitoring what's going on in those areas every day to ensure that you factor in any changes that are needed, or even looking at trending is a significant amount of work. So I think, RIM platforms or service providers that offer some assistance for things like regulatory monitoring could help your teams become more strategic, because you're not dealing necessarily with all the noise that's out there. You're getting more pointed, very specific information that's more relevant in front of you to to evaluate. In addition, I think streamlining processes internally is a way that can help your team become more strategic over time.
Okay, and then we'll do one final question. What is the single biggest mindset change after the webinar? What should people take away as the final nugget?
Yeah, I think understanding the value add regulatory has to the business objectives and the commercial piece of it. I think understanding that no, we're not selling and we're not, adding to the bottom line in that way, but our work directly influences it. And if we do it well, we can help to increase that revenue. If we don't do it well, then likewise, we can take away from that revenue. So understanding what a critical role we have in terms of the business objectives, I would say is the biggest takeaway that the team should walk away with today, and think about how can you influence that within your organization.
Perfect. I think that was a great way to end it, and we're right at the top of the hour. So thanks again, Jodi, for everything you provided for us today. If anybody has questions, send them in to us, and then we will send out the replay and slide deck by the end of the week. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.